I would now like to introduce our speaker for this evening, Jeremiah Barber, who is actually an alum of our BFA program and a visual artist who is now based in San Francisco. His solo performances have appeared at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago and at the Q Foundation in New York, and he's exhibited nationally and internationally, including the Headlands Center for the Artists in Sausalito, California, and the Lab in San Francisco. And a former member of Marina and Abramovic's independent performance group, he works as a solo artist in performance, sculpture, and video. He also works collaboratively with the artist collective 100 Days Action, which he co-founded in 2016. Barber has been a resident at the Cité Internationale des Arts in Paris and the Djerassi Resident Artists Program and the Millay Colony for the Arts. In 2015, Barber was awarded the Eureka Fellowship from the Fleishhacker Foundation. Barber received a master's degree in fine art from Stanford University and currently teaches sculpture at the University of California, Davis. For this talk, Jeremiah will share his insights on his process and his consideration of all things in regards to response and our abilities in our world as it is. And then I will join him for a question and answer, drawing upon submissions that come from our students and then also our viewers. So please do be sure to enter your queries and thoughts into the YouTube chat. Now, please join me in welcoming Jeremiah Barber.
It's such a pleasure to be able to speak to the Columbia community. The school has a lot of meaning for me and a community that I still feel really attached to. So I'm really excited to be able to connect with you all and to see what you all are working on as we do studio visits. I want to thank some of the teachers that I worked with at Columbia, especially people that are still involved in my life and my work, Adam Brooks and Matt Wilson and Mexican Cap. Many more examples, but these are people that really invest something that goes beyond the classroom and are very dear to me. So I also want to thank some of the artists that are in my community and that some of my work is currently kind of bouncing off and that I've been in dialogue with. Alicia Escott and Dorothy Santos and Surabhi Saraf and Moira Williams. These are all artists and writers whose work is really inspiring me right now. And I hope I'll get a chance to share some more of that with you as we meet. I guess this initially was going to be an in-person visit, of course, and as the quarantine has taken place, that has kind of altered my studio practice, as I'm sure it's altered everyone's lives. And so I thought it would be more interesting to spend this time trying to focus on the singular idea that I've really been focusing on since the beginning of the quarantine, and to look at the ways in which, being in this space, which right now I'm broadcasting from my kitchen, which is also my studio, which is also my classroom. And as probably a lot of you have seen from just a couple of weeks ago, there was a day in which the sun didn't rise in Northern California because there was so much smoke over the skies. And so it's a really interesting perspective to be in as a maker and someone who's trying to respond to what's happening in the world. And I thought it would be more interesting to perhaps talk about some of the ideas that I've been looking at. And then also as a sculptor, I have a very different kind of set of limitations that I'm working with right now. And so I've really been developing my work in relationship to writing and relationship to reading. And so I'm going to share this kind of messier research process with you tonight, along with some images of more recent projects that were out in the landscape. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and go into my slides here. I've called this talk A Handbreadth of Time, which is a reference to the idea of measuring time using a human lens. And this is actually an attempt to maybe break away from that type of measurement. This is a story that focuses on globules of flesh, pockets of skin that hold pockets of water, and with a bundle of sensory nerves. Nerves that transmit incoming waves, light waves that might become images, and sound waves that might become speech or melody. This is something of a visual essay. It's an attempt at telling the narrative of multi-species photography and film. It's not specifically a history, although it is interested in this confusion that we have that chronological narratives are the same thing as evolution, that they both kind of result in improved outcomes. I'm interested in challenging that idea, and so one of the things that I've done is remove the dates from this lecture. I'm thinking about this problem that we have in art and in science, that the idea of arriving at an image first is something to be praised, and thinking about that as a potential erasure of already established knowledge, and also a way that complex stories get told as singular events. The other thing that I've done is reimagined outcomes. So in the same way that jellyfish are thought to have mixed the oceans and pulled up life from the deep, I'm interested in a messier form of storytelling. I'm taking inspiration from Donna Haraway and asked the students to read the first chapter of Staying with the Trouble, in which Haraway writes, "These are stories in which multi-species players, who are enmeshed in partial and flawed translations across difference, redo ways of living and dying." So I'm going to finish my talk today talking about some of the thoughts that I've had about this current state of living and dying that we're living through. And in reimagining those outcomes, I'm thinking about what is the potential for us to pass on through the jellyfish and through the sixth extinction. So our story begins with language, with the commingling of three words. The chamber is a word that refers initially to a cavity, could have been applied to architecture or the bodies that meet in architectural spaces, but also to a cavity in the body. So the eye, for example, could be a chamber, and it birthed the word camera. And this commingles with the word chimera, which is a figure from Greek mythology. And it's a monster that bears the traits of multiple species. And then more recently, this word has come to mean something that's impossible to achieve, or perhaps an organism that humans have altered to carry the genetic code of different species. Multi-species seeing precedes industrial production. So the earliest versions of this are biological and tend to be very violent. René Descartes, for example, described taking notes made by Da Vinci in order to dissect the eye of an ox and look through the lens. And he squeezed the lens to describe how light bends. The mechanical tools for multi-species seeing were developed at the same moment of colonial conquest and of Western expansion. Teju Cole wrote of this era that photography was used to image the world in order to study, profit from it, and own it. And so one of the earliest designs for moving pictures was a rifle. And this relationship that was baked into this tool is still present in our terminology. We still use the word shoot. It's been well explored by different writers, Rowan Barthes and Susan Sontag, who wrote that photography converts the whole world into a cemetery. Millay, in fact, designed this and published images of it as a tool for aiming at the motion of birds. And another person that you might be more familiar with in the similar lines, Edward Muybridge, was an English expatriate who lived in San Francisco, and a series that he did called Horse in Motion, an experiment which was done in a Palo Alto racetrack and funded by Leland Stanford. And Muybridge, in order to display these moving images of horses, built a custom projector, which he called the zoopraxiscope, which was literally the device for displaying the movement of animals. Muybridge and Millay both were pursuing cinema as a way to expand human senses. They wanted to see things that the eye couldn't see because they moved too fast. Both of them chose animals as their subject. I suspect that neither of them saw the violence that was a part of their image-making weapons. And I believe that's because they both saw the natural world as something that was in service to their own interests. None of these figures are heroic, even though we talk about them in that sense. Muybridge was a workaholic. He spent months away from his wife and child. And when he was on a trip and his wife took a lover, Muybridge returned and killed the man in cold blood. He then placed his son in an orphanage and abandoned his wife, who died at the age of 24. He signed his work Helios, God of the Sun. And along with Stanford, who was a staunch white supremacist, they often publicized the names of these projects under the name of the horse involved, while omitting the names of the jockeys. So these plates are still referred to by the name of the horse. The jockey in this series is a black rider whose name was never recorded. This is a slightly older piece. Even though the sport at the time was primarily run by black jockeys who were successful sports celebrities. Stanford and Muybridge used these images in order to make a propaganda campaign for Western expansion and to promote Stanford's railroad project to the west. So one of my questions is, what is actually baked into these tools that were developed by Muybridge and Millay? And to quote Donna Haraway, who was actually quoting her teacher, it matters what ideas we use to think ideas with. Just a couple years ago, scientists at Harvard have used CRISPR to embed 5 frames of the Muybridge animation into the genetic code of a living bacteria, E. coli, and then read that code back. So this action at once creates this camera chimera of man, and horse, and bacteria, and also just expands this idea of pioneerism, at this point including living life forms onto which they're authoring their ideas. So that's the history. I mean, that's the real origin of these devices. There are non-violent versions of them, which I'm going to focus on for the rest of the talk, without attempting to completely overlook some of the ways in which biomimicry has come back as a tool for our weaponization and a kind of sense that human interest is at the center of basically all kinds of practices of imaging and engineering. Another version of the light meter relies on the movement of what are called nyctinastic plants, which are night-pressed plants. Nyctinastic plants are ones that close their leaves or their flowers with the presence or absence of the sun. So with the regularity of that movement, the photographer has a reference point for the amount of sunlight that's available. I've grown and tested a variety of these plants, including morning glory, pole bean, California poppy, clover, and sap pea, and found that this one plant, Mimosa pudica, is particularly reliable for camera exposure. The name means mocking herb, or it comes from mime, the word mime. It's a plant that mimics the movement of animals. And because its movement is really dramatic and it's very consistent, you can take a look at the leaves and their current position, and with a visual guide, determine how to set your camera exposure. So while I was testing these, I used time-lapse photography to try and record the position of the leaves throughout the day. And I tried to shoot video of every single plant that I grew, and this one was, as I said, it was the most successful. And I was trying to record time-lapse footage that started at dawn and went all the way to dusk. And I had been working on this particular plant. I had a relationship with this plant for 4 months. And at the time of shooting this video, I was about 10 hours into this time lapse when I got a notification that I had a package that I needed to pick up. So I left my apartment, and when I came back, which was at about 4 p.m., I discovered that my cat had devoured the plant. Honestly, I was heartbroken. I started crying. I started crying when I saw that she had eaten it. The amount of time that kind of went by before, and the delicacy with which I set up the situation, it was really such a disappointment to lose this plant. But then as time went on, I started thinking about it differently. It was interesting to me how I had developed this kind of multi-species relationship with this plant over the course of months. And I'm thinking that I'm giving this plant everything it needs. I'm giving it food and water and checking how much sunlight it needs. And it's sharing something with me too. It's sharing how the sun moves and how much sun there is. But in all of that, I didn't consider this other species in the experiment. Cats eat plants to aid in their digestion. Fiber cleans out their intestinal tract of parasites. So it's a natural part of the process that my cat would want to be involved in this. And warning, this next slide is a little gross. This is the proud face of my cat Renee after having eaten my artwork and then her vomit that she produced. If you think about it, 99% of all photos and films are all made on a tool that is reductive of our own senses. Our vision through our cameras could be compared to a copepod, the only animal that I was able to find that has just a single eye. So this idea of more complex vision extends to other animals that have multiple perspectives. The tuatara, which has a third eye on top of its head. Lapse, which is an amazing fish actually, it has 2 eyes, but it has 4 irises and 4 retina. So it swims along the surface of the water, and with 2 of the irises, it's seeing above water, and with 2 irises, it's seeing below water. And the curvature of its lens changes for the refraction of water. So it's capturing 4 images within 2 eyes. And the starfish, which has an eye in each of the ends of its arms. And this goes on. Spiders with 8 eyes, jellyfish with 24 eyes, and scallops that have thousands of light-sensitive organs. And bird's eye vision, which was explored by Julius Neubronner. Neubronner's father, an apothecary, and he kept pigeons and used them to deliver emergency prescriptions from the sanatorium nearby. And one time, a pigeon went missing and was found and turned up on their doorstep weeks later. And Julius wondered if the pigeon had been equipped with a camera, if a single photo could have possibly told the story of where this pigeon had been during those several weeks. And ended up spending years developing cameras that were lightweight and that had a timer, and even had cameras that could advance film in order to take multiple photos on a single flight. This is probably the most popular photo of the series that shows the wing of the pigeon. But I'm kind of more interested in this photo, which looks back on this pigeon handler. And I love the framing and the tilt of this, and the perspective that this shows of the man and the cage from which the pigeon was released and would be returning to. In order to make this process more mobile and record other landscapes, Neubronner built a carriage that had a dovecote on the top and a darkroom on the bottom, and the whole thing was pulled by a horse, because of course it was. I just think this is a kind of a lovely establishment of these relationships, but it's really heartbreaking to see where he decided to take this. He was always interested in the potential of capitalizing on this as a technology. Pigeons were already used in warfare at the time of Neubronner. They were very common to carry spycraft, to carry handwritten messages, but still he sought an audience with the Prussian War Ministry, where he attempted to sell his technology of photographing birds, and they basically dismissed him. By World War II, there were thousands of pigeons sending messages in the war. There were also hawks that were trained to release and hunt down the pigeons. There were humans that were trained to shoot down the hawks and the pigeons. And there were dogs that were trained to carry and release the pigeons away from the hawks and the human snipers. So we have this complex web of animal actors that are all brought onto the battlefield and made into these chimerical monsters and forced to carry out a type of warfare. And all because they carry specific traits that some of which we still don't even understand. how much do we actually understand about how a dog experiences the world through scent? How much do we actually understand about how a pigeon navigates? We think that they see magnetic fields, but we actually don't exactly know how they can navigate thousands of miles. Another form of the movement of the camera comes from a crane. And so this word to crane, which is to stretch one's neck to see, had already been used figuratively in literature. These are Sandhill Cranes. And they would inspire the cantilevered movement that in film produces swooping organic footage. So I'm going to show 3 of these cranes. This first one is 9 feet long. It's made from a solid birch tree, and it's sited in a wetland habitat where the birch tree is common. And this is the second. It's a 16-foot long oak tree crane. Each of these is shot on a cell phone, and they have a mount for the viewer to use their own camera. And they're cantilevered with stones that are found on site. You can see there's a large stone there that counterbalances the weight of the crane. And I'll show just a couple details of this. There's a smaller weight system with small stones, and they can be adjusted by distance so they can balance out any different camera weight. And additionally, there's a gear at the top which is attached to the pivot point of the crane and keeps the camera in a constant horizontal position. This is the last of these. This is a 23-foot long crane that's made from a hickory tree. The thing that these becoming with relationships allow is they seem like an attempt at multispecies dialogue that doesn't assume that the dialogue is understood by all of the parties. I think it's fair to say that Donna Haraway kind of sums that up in her term of getting on together. In this film, which is by William Finley and Arthur Pack, they trekked up to Boulder Pass in Glacier National Park to try and film mountain goats. And once they arrived, they seem to have come up with this different idea of what their film should be. And they started intercutting themselves, doing goat-like actions alongside with the goats, but never in the same frame. And as the film goes on, it kind of devolves to a point where they're no longer even really trying to replicate goat motion. They kind of seem to just be playfully inhabiting their bodies in this amazing landscape. And we see some of these ideas in more recent projects. This is the photographer Batali, who was hired by National Geographic to photograph the pandas of the Wulong Nature Preserve. And she was dressed as a panda so as not to disturb the rewilding efforts, and spent 5 years there. Most of the photographs that she turned in, and the ones that are definitely the most interesting, are of the panda handlers themselves and not of the pandas. So one of the things that I think is interesting about this becoming with relationship is that it kind of becomes harder for us to focus our attention in the same manner of the gaze or the voyeur, the way that these earlier versions of nature photography and nature in art tend to simplify the world, these efforts tend to make them more complex. So I'm going to finish today by talking about jellyfish and talking about what ideas I use currently to think my ideas with. This is my underwater camera rig, and it was used to photograph the jellyfish that you saw in the opening. It could be that you don't see the difference between footage that's captured on this driftwood camera rig. There are 2 jellyfish species that are inferiomortal, and those are only the ones that we know about. The scientist that I've talked to at UC Davis believes that it's possible that many more jellyfish are actually immortal. The way that we've only tested these couple species is by introducing stressors into their environment. And what they see is that the jellyfish degrow. They grow in reverse. They revert to earlier forms of their life cycle. There are jellyfish that have lenses and eyes that are similar to our own, but they have no nervous system or brain. So the manner in which they process visual information is through their bodies. And so I'm just going to show a clip of the footage that I've been working on before the wildfires came into California, and share just some of the thoughts that I've been thinking as I've been thinking about jellyfish. When I think of time, I think of the sun, how it causes plants to open and close, grows things, and then causes them to decay. What does the sun crossing the sky look like to a jellyfish? Can it play the sun forward and backward? I'm thinking of my own frame of vision, how it alters and changes. Which chimeras am I responsible to? Which chimeras do I make myself responsible to? How can I, as I expand my own senses, keep from multiplying my flaws? I'm thinking about what I would want to say to the jellyfish. But is the umwelt the barrier that's between us? Or is that an invention of those that can't see how we're connected? Maybe it's something that I need to say alongside the jellyfish. And will the jellyfish say something alongside me? The jellyfish, it seems, are speaking of time and how time moves forward and back.